Bullies humiliate the new kid, but he's hiding a brutal skill. Imagine being the constant target of humiliation, mockery, and aggression. Now imagine that behind that fragile appearance, you're hiding a secret powerful enough to turn the tables in the most brutal way. That's exactly what happened when a group of bullies chose the wrong victim. They thought they were dealing with a defenseless kid, but when the truth came out, they learned the hard way that they had made a fatal mistake. This is the story of a new kid who arrived at school surrounded by mystery. No one knew where he came from. No one knew what he was capable of, but everyone found out too late. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to transform into something no one expected? Get ready. This story will shock you. The boy arrived at school on a gray, cloudy morning, carrying an old backpack and keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His name was Ethan, and to most students, he seemed like just another random kid. But there was something about him that no one could quite explain. Ethan didn't try to fit in. He sat at the back of the classroom, always silent, scribbling in his notebook while the other students whispered about him. "Who is that guy?" they murmured. "Why doesn't he talk to anyone?" The truth was, Ethan was used to being alone. He had switched schools so many times that he didn't even bother making friends anymore. Every time he started to get attached to a place, something happened and he had to leave. But this time, something felt different. It all started during lunch break. Ethan was sitting alone, eating slowly, when he felt a shadow loom over him. He glanced up slightly and saw 3 boys approaching, smirking. The leader of the group, Troy, tossed his backpack onto Ethan's table and leaned in. "Hey, new kid, you look kinda lost." The others chuckled. Ethan didn't respond. He just kept eating as if he hadn't heard them. Troy didn't like the lack of reaction. "I'm talking to you, freak." Ethan sighed and slowly lifted his gaze. For the first time, his eyes met Troy's. There was something in that stare that made the bully hesitate for a fraction of a second, but he quickly shook it off and grabbed Ethan's tray, tossing his food onto the floor. "Oops, looks like your hand slipped." The whole table erupted in laughter. Ethan remained silent, just observing. He picked up a napkin, calmly wiped his hands, and without saying a word, stood up to leave. "Hey, you're not gonna clean up that mess?" Troy mocked. But Ethan was already gone. Troy and the other bullies laughed, satisfied. To them, Ethan was just another weakling, but they had no idea what they had just awakened. Troy and his gang weren't the type to let things go. To them, Ethan's silent reaction wasn't a sign of indifference, it was a challenge. And bullies like Troy didn't like to be ignored. The next few days, Ethan found himself at the center of their unwanted attention. It started with small things, bumping into him in the hallway, knocking books out of his hands, whispering insults just loud enough for him to hear. "What's wrong, new kid? Too scared to say anything?" Ethan never reacted. He would just pick up his books, straighten his hoodie, and keep walking. But the more he ignored them, the worse it got. One afternoon, as he was heading to the gym locker room, he felt a shove from behind. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before hitting the lockers. Troy stood behind him, arms crossed, smirking. "Oops, guess you weren't paying attention." Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. Again, he didn't say a word. The silence made Troy's blood boil. "What's your problem, huh? Think you're too good to talk to us?" One of Troy's friends, a stocky guy named Brandon, stepped forward and grabbed Ethan's backpack, yanking it off his shoulders. "Let's see what freak boy's hiding in here." Brandon unzipped the bag and dumped its contents onto the floor. Notebooks, pencils, a worn-out paperback book, all scattered across the dirty locker room tiles. Ethan clenched his fists for the first time, not because of the bullying, not because of the taunts, but because they had touched his book, the only thing that truly mattered to him. Troy noticed the change in his demeanor and laughed. "Oh, did we finally get a reaction?" Ethan took a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. He crouched down, picking up his things one by one, his movements deliberate, controlled. Brandon scoffed. Dude, he's not even gonna fight back. What a joke. Ethan stood up, dusted off his book, and met Troy's eyes once more. There it was again. That unsettling, calm stare. For a brief moment, Troy felt uneasy. He didn't know why, but something about the way Ethan looked at him sent a shiver down his spine. But the feeling passed just as quickly. You're lucky we're feeling nice today, Troy sneered. Next time we won't be. With that, the bullies walked away, laughing. Ethan watched them go, gripping his book tightly. They had no idea. They had no idea that next time would be different. For days, Ethan endured the torment in silence. The whispers, the shoves, the stolen books. He let it all happen without a word. But every time they pushed him, mocked him, or tried to break him, something inside him grew colder, sharper. He wasn't afraid of them. He was waiting. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. It was gym class, and the coach had stepped out for a few minutes. The students were left to mess around, tossing basketballs and chatting. Ethan stood by himself near the bleachers, stretching his arms, when he heard the familiar voice behind him. Look who's all alone again. Troy, of course. Ethan exhaled through his nose, already knowing what was coming. You don't talk much, do you, freak? Troy continued, stepping closer. That's all right. Maybe we should help you speak up. The gym had fallen quieter. A few students had noticed the confrontation and were watching, whispering. Ethan remained calm, his expression unreadable. Then, before he could react, wham! Troy's fist slammed into Ethan's stomach. A murmur of shock rippled through the gym. Ethan stumbled back a step but didn't fall. He barely even flinched. Troy frowned. What the hell? It didn't make sense. He had put enough force into that punch to hurt, to make Ethan double over, to make him gasp for air. But Ethan just stood there, staring at him with those same eerie, emotionless eyes. Troy's pride flared up. He hated that look. Fine, let's see if you can take this. He swung again, aiming for Ethan's ribs, but this time something changed. Just as the punch was about to land, Ethan moved. Not a flinch, not a recoil. He simply shifted his body to the side, just enough for Troy's fist to cut through empty air. The movement was so precise, so fluid, that for a split second Troy felt like he was fighting a ghost. The sudden miss threw him off balance. Before he could regain his footing, Ethan took a single step forward, too close now, dangerously close, and whispered something only Troy could hear. Don't do that again. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a plea, it was a warning. Troy's skin crawled. For the first time, he felt like prey. The moment was over in an instant. Ethan stepped back, his expression blank, his stance relaxed. To everyone else watching, it looked like nothing had happened. Troy, breathing hard, forced out a laugh, shoving Ethan's shoulder. Whatever, man. You're still a freak. But as he turned away, his hands trembled. Ethan stood still, watching Troy's retreating form. He could have ended it right there, but not yet. Not until they pushed him past the point of no return, and that moment was coming soon. The tension between Ethan and Troy's gang was growing. The bullies could feel it, even if they didn't understand it. Every shove, every insult, every stolen book, it all felt off, like they were poking at something they shouldn't. And then came the night that changed everything. The school gym was mostly empty after hours, except for a few late practice athletes and the janitor cleaning the halls. That's why Troy and his friends figured it was the perfect time to teach Ethan a real lesson, somewhere no teachers would interfere. They had been watching him. Ethan always left school at the same time, always taking the back exit near the gym, where the lights flickered and the security cameras barely worked. That night, they waited in the shadows. As Ethan stepped outside, pulling his hoodie over his head, a voice called out, "Go in somewhere, freak." Ethan sighed. He didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. Slowly, he pivoted on his heel. Troy. Brandon. A third boy, Logan, who was taller than both of them and cracked his knuckles like he had been waiting for this moment all day. Troy stepped forward, arms crossed. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone today." Ethan didn't respond. Troy's jaw clenched. "I don't like when people make me look stupid." Brandon smirked, stepping beside Troy. Maybe he's just too dumb to understand. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Then, for the first time since he arrived at the school, he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it sent an immediate chill through the air. Troy felt his skin crawl again, that same unshakable feeling that something was wrong. Before he could process it, Ethan spoke. "Do you really want to do this?" His voice was calm, not scared, not angry, just calm. Troy scoffed, covering his unease with bravado. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan sighed, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "I was hoping to avoid this, but I guess you won't stop until you get what you're looking for." Logan took a step forward. "Yeah? And what exactly are we looking for, tough guy?" Ethan finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "A fight." Silence. Then Troy laughed. "You? You think you can fight us?" Ethan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't deny it. Troy's smirk faltered. Logan, impatient, had enough. He lunged, fast, faster than Troy or Brandon expected, but Ethan was faster. Before Logan's hands could even graze his hoodie, Ethan's body moved like a blur. One step, a pivot, a flick of the wrist, and suddenly Logan was on the ground, gasping for air. Brandon's eyes widened. "What the?" Logan clutched his stomach, wheezing. He hadn't even seen the hit. Ethan rolled his shoulders, exhaling. That was a warning. Troy felt real fear crawl up his spine, because now he knew. Ethan wasn't just some quiet, weak loser. He was something else, something dangerous, and they had just messed with the wrong guy. For the first time in his life, Troy felt something he had never expected to feel. Fear. Ethan stood there, completely relaxed, as Logan gasped on the ground, struggling to breathe. The air had changed. The power had shifted. And Troy hated it. Brandon, still in shock, took a hesitant step back. "He cheated or something," he stammered. "There's no way." Before he could finish his sentence, Ethan moved again. One swift step, a precise twist of his body. Too fast. Brandon barely had time to register what was happening before he felt an immense pressure on his wrist, and then suddenly he was on his knees, his arm twisted behind his back. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder, not enough to break, just enough to make him realize that Ethan was in complete control. Ethan leaned in slightly. His voice was low, even, and ice cold. "I could dislocate your shoulder in less than a second. Do you want that?" Brandon shook his head frantically. No, man, chill." Ethan released him instantly. Brandon collapsed onto the pavement, cradling his arm, scrambling away like a wounded animal. Troy felt his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't right. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had always been the predator, not the prey. Logan was down. Brandon was out. That just left him. Ethan turned his gaze toward Troy now. Troy clenched his fists, forcing himself to mask his fear with anger. "You think you're tough, huh?" he spat. "Just because you got in a lucky hit?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. That same eerie, almost amused smile played on his lips. "Lucky?" he repeated, "if that's what you need to believe." That was it. That was the final straw. Troy let out a roar and charged forward, throwing a wild punch, but he never even saw Ethan move. In the blink of an eye, Ethan sidestepped. Troy's own momentum carried him forward, straight into Ethan's counterattack. A precise elbow strike to the ribs, a calculated sweep to the legs. Before Troy could even process what was happening, he was on the ground, flat on his back, staring up at the night sky. His breath was gone. His body felt completely useless. Ethan loomed over him, hands in his pockets, looking completely unbothered. Troy coughed, struggling to get up, but his body wouldn't move. Ethan crouched down beside him, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "You've spent your whole life thinking you're the strongest, haven't you?" Troy gritted his teeth, his face burning with humiliation. Screw you," he spat. Ethan didn't react. "I warned you," he continued, "but you wouldn't listen." He leaned in slightly, just enough so Troy could hear the final words that would haunt him for years. "Now, you'll never forget me." Then, just like that, Ethan stood up, turned away, and walked off into the night, leaving Troy, Brandon, and Logan broken on the pavement. And for the first time in his life, Troy knew what it felt like to be powerless. The next day at school, everything had changed. Word spread fast. No one knew exactly what had happened behind the gym that night, but everyone knew Troy and his gang weren't the same. Logan had a bruised rib and walked slower than usual. Brandon barely spoke, keeping his head down in class. And Troy was different. The once feared bully was quiet now. He didn't shove kids in the hallway. He didn't smirk and laugh with his gang. He didn't even look in Ethan's direction. Ethan, as always, acted like nothing had happened. He went to class, took notes, and sat alone at lunch. But people were watching him now. They whispered, they stared. They didn't know who he really was, but they knew one thing for sure. Troy had picked a fight with the wrong guy. Later that day, in the locker room, Ethan was packing up his things when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned slowly. Troy stood there, alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Troy muttered, "What are you?" Ethan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Troy clenched his fists, frustration flashing in his eyes, but not the usual arrogance. It was something else now. "You could have destroyed me last night. You could have humiliated me in front of everyone, but you didn't." Ethan just shrugged. "Because I didn't need to." Troy swallowed hard, the weight of that answer settling in. He had spent his whole life believing strength was about dominance, but Ethan was stronger than him in every way possible, and yet he didn't even care about power. Troy hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he did something no one ever expected from him. He held out his hand, a silent gesture, a truce. Ethan looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. No words were spoken after that, no apologies, no speeches, just an unspoken understanding. Troy had learned his lesson, and Ethan had done what he always did. He walked away. Some fights aren't about fists. Some victories aren't about revenge. Ethan never wanted to be feared. He never wanted to prove anything. But sometimes, when the world pushes too hard, you have to push back, not with anger, but with control, because true strength is knowing when to fight and when to walk away. What did you think of this story? Have you ever seen someone go from underestimated to unstoppable? Let us know in the comments.